So let me just summarize where we are in our discussion so far. Couldry's work on digital colonialism, Couldry and Mayhaw's work on digital colonialism, certainly suggests that there's something insidious and global going on in the intrusion of digital platforms and the data that they accrue across all forms of social life. And this is something which is deeply related to the experience of power and the self, where basically we are alienated from the fruits of our labor by extractive technologies that that attach a particular kind of economic value to the data that we generate when we go about our everyday business. Bain suggests something perhaps a little less threatening. She simply introduces the idea that the sorts of technologies that worry Couldry, when they're applied to education, they're done so in quite an unthinking way. We pay too little attention to the ideology that is implicit in the language that we use to talk about learning technologies, which means that we don't really think about the consequences that Couldry outlines. Now, in this third video, what I want to do is talk about some of the methodological implications of the discussion so far. And this really takes some of the insights from Couldry and Bain about the ideologies of digital platforms that accrue evidence about what media users do and applies it more to some more general research principles around research methodologies, which aren't quite so political. Couldry is really talking about a process of abstraction, which is deeply related to the question of generalizability. Couldry is basically saying that when we as individuals use media technologies, our actions have a consequence beyond anything that we're conscious of, beyond our immediate wants, needs, and intentions. And so, what we're talking about is the importance of thinking about how looking at how people use media is about far more than simply asking what they think they're doing. That's not to say that that's unimportant, but it is to say that when we use digital media, we are we are enmeshed in what the anthropologist Clifford Geertz famously called webs of significance. We connect to global economies through networks which we know, as from Couldry's analysis, have really pointed political effects. And so when we are studying what individuals or small groups of people are doing with media, we need to think about those broader contexts. And that's why the question of power and the question of ideology is an important part of your project. And you need to think about how those questions relate to it. But equally, one of the things that we've seen is that one of the problems with accounting for that broader context is that quite often when we do that, we do it with numbers. We try and quantify what most of the people are doing most of the time with most of the technologies. But there are limitations to that, though. Numbers don't tell us everything that we need to know. And that quite often making data, making individual or small group actions meaningful in a social context actually doesn't mean using numbers. It means using qualitative approaches that are quite often summarized under the notion of thick description. And I want to introduce you to the methodological reading from this week by Leeds Hurwitz on thick description. And I want you to think about how you can apply these methods to your own work. I want to talk about what thick description is as a method and how it relates to qualitative research, but also how it relates to some of the ideas that you've already learned as media students. So, what is a thick description as a research principle? And I suppose what I'm going to discuss thick description in relation to is talking about the problem of data as discussed in the previous video, and talking about the way that the sorts of big data that are generated by things like what happens when you log on to Moodle can be thought of as a sort of thin description of what people are doing. That is, we can look at the numbers of what you're doing on Moodle and we can say, well, it tells us certain important data. What are people looking at? What are they not looking at? But it's pretty clear there's a whole bunch of things that it doesn't tell us. It doesn't tell us, for example, how long you're looking at things, but also it doesn't tell you why you're looking at things, what you're doing, what the context is. And all of this is important information. And this is what is involved in the notion of thick description. So, thick description basically is an idea that looks at, represents the idea of looking at how media users, people who create media, looking at media practices and looking at them in a real depth, spending a lot of time thinking about what people are doing with media, but also why they're doing those things. And I suppose it represents where you've encountered these ideas. Is it takes what we might call a semiotic approach to researching media users. Now, this is important because if we look at a quantitative approach to looking at media users, we simply measure what they do. Yes, we simply look at how many people are looking at this particular video. If we're talking about online education, how many people are tuning in for how long to what, and that's all we need to know. Now, a semiotic approach would look at those numbers and say, but what do they represent? So, quantitative approaches assume that numbers speak for themselves. Taking a more semiotic approach looks at numbers and say, but we need to interpret what's going on here. What's behind the numbers? What's building them? What do they represent? How can the same numbers mean different things? Now, let me go a little bit more in depth here. So, the important thing that I want to alert you to about the notion of thick description is it originates in regard particularly to participant observation and ethnography, which we've already talked about. But I think really in the contemporary media studies world, you need to regard thick description as more of a research attitude. What rich description, what thick description originally meant was looking at cultural settings, looking at people operating as they did in a particular cultural setting, and looking at their behavior as problematic. And what this meant was that when you come across a new cultural scene and you see people behaving in a particular way, you need to regard their behavior as a puzzle. It's something that needs to be interpreted. You can look at and describe their behaviors, but what's really important is we need to understand why people are behaving in the way that they do. And to do that, we need to watch them doing it for a long time, but we also need to talk to them and ask them to explain to us why they're doing things in particular ways. Now, immediately you can see the relation of this to the problems of big data, because big data can tell us what people are doing through digital platforms, but it can't tell us anything really about why people are acting in the way that they are. So instead of looking at a particular piece of big data as evidence, as a fact, instead, from a thick description point of view, what we look at it is as a code. And this is where semiotics comes in. So you know from your semiotics training in the first year that a sign can only be interpreted via a code. That is, that you need to have the key to unlock the meaning of a particular sign, because the meaning of signs are created through intersubjective agreements. And we need to know what those intersubjective agreements are. We need to know how people commonly interpret particular things in particular ways. So, what that means from the point of view of if you're looking at big data. So, we know that cultural meaning is co created between people in a particular context. Now, the problem with big data is that it is extracted from in extracting information from media users. You lose the code. You lose any explanation or from the participant point of view of why they are behaving in the way that they do. So let me give you an example. If we think about the big data about your Moodle usage, some of you aren't using. So we have kind of this data that shows that some of you are using certain resources, and others of you aren't. And it puts you all in the same category. You're either using it or you're not. But what we know is that whether or not you can be using that data or not using that resource for different reasons. Perhaps you can't be bothered, perhaps you're not interested, or perhaps you're not ready yet. Perhaps you're going to use a resource when it's actually relevant to your learning. So you can have the same evidence, someone using a piece of, using a particular resource, and it can mean completely different things. So some people might be using a resource because they're really interested in it. Some people might be using it just because they think they have to. So what this tells us is the value of actually spending time going behind big data and saying, well, okay, I'm not just simply going to measure how many people are using a particular resource for how long, but I'm going to find who those people are. And I'm going to try and find their accounts of why they are or are not using a particular resource. And what you'll find when you do that is behind some fairly simple statistics, people either accessing and using a resource or not accessing and using digital media, there can be a whole range of different motivations, incentives, and disincentives that explain why people are behaving in the way that they do. So the problem with big data is it treats media use as unproblematic. When we know from experience that media use is driven by a whole range of desires, needs, interests that are deeply connected with social context. And a thick description aims to figure out what that context is and attempts to give meaning to figures which arguably don't mean very much in isolation.